Good evening and welcome once again to the Commander's Gridiron. I'm your host, Steve Lockman, where we talk all things on and off the field about our beloved Washington Commanders. And as you kind of noticed, we have swung into a little later time slot that is not actually by accident whatsoever. Kind of henceforth, moving forward, this will be our new time slot, 8:30 to 9:30. Tuesday nights is where you can catch us here at Out of the Box Sports Entertainment on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, mainly because of the fire department schedule and the baby schedule as well here at home. We kind of were able to flex our time to go back a little bit later in the evening. And this is where you're going to find us every Tuesday night in season at 8:30 p.m. In the off season, meanwhile, as we gear up, since the Super Bowl just ended this past Sunday night, going through the off season and into training camp, we're going to try to go about every third week. And what that does is that kind of follows the fire department schedule because I work every third Tuesday. And so the first Tuesday that I'm not working is when we're going to try and have the show here at Commander's Gridiron. And, it'll give us plenty of stuff to talk about, having missed, 1 to 2 weeks and what happens with our team. There's always no shortage of stuff to talk about, as we're going to find out tonight. Hey, Dave, thanks for checking in. You can catch Dave on Dem 215 Boys show every Wednesday night in the prime time slot, where they talk all things about our enemy and division rival, the Dallas Cowboys. But as we touch off tonight's episode here at Commander's Gridiron, one of the first things, since we don't get many victories on the field, we got to talk about the victories that we get off the field, right? And as you see at the ticker, scrolling at the bottom of your page where all of our topics are kind of listed for tonight's episode, the first topic for tonight is the Commander's trademark. And something that kind of was buried, so to speak, in the DC media this week was actually the rare but super important victory for the Commanders and management and ownership, that the U.S. Patent and Trade Office actually granted the first 2 trademark registrations on the Washington Commanders name. So while this doesn't seem like a lot and doesn't seem, big newsworthy, knowing all the trademark issues that we went through with the previous name, actually 2 names ago, in the Washington Redskins, and then the interim name, the Washington Football Team, kind of seeing how fast this happened since we branded as Washington Commanders, and then when it officially became, basically patented for trademark purposes, it's actually a really quick process, so to speak, this time around. So it kind of shows a couple things, right? A, ownership went ahead, trademarked everything and got it patented, so that way they can do all the license deals, they can do everything else, and everything else that's going on. And obviously it also kind of shows fans that look, we're not going back to the old name, as much as many people we want that. We've discussed that till I'm blue in the face on this show and every other show that's out there, podcast, sports media, the whole 9 yards. So for the time being, probably at least for the next year or two, we're the Commanders. That's where we're going to be. That's what we're going to stick with. And, we're going to talk about it here coming up a little bit, that, even Josh Harris had some talk about, where the name change-ish might fall into play in terms of things. But, like I said, getting these 2 patents that they applied for and trademark registrations, were huge for the team. Puts a lot of stuff in the rearview mirror and lets them move forward with a lot of other plans, licensing arrangements, sponsorships, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on and on. So, knowing that is now out of the way, one of the things that kind of popped up, and you're absolutely right, Dan, there's big changes in DC. And whether it's on the field, off the field, we're going to talk about it here later tonight, but we basically wiped 90% of our coaching staff as well, which we're going to talk about in the second half of the show tonight. And, lots of changes, lots of good stuff. Not too many head shakers, tilts, and flat out no's. So that's kind of a good thing. You're not going to please the fan base in everything you do. And trust me, there's always a lot going on. And as Dave checks in, we're going to talk about his team tonight too, and the Dallas Cowboys, because obviously our head coach came from there. Some of our coaching staff came from there, and we're basically just poaching them guys like it's going out of style. Dave actually chimes in at the right time. Why is your squad stealing all of our coaches? I think we're up to 3 now. We were at 2, and then lo and behold, I saw we grabbed another one this afternoon. So not only are we poaching the Cowboys, we're poaching the Eagles. Hell, we poached even one dude from the New York Giants, even Dan's beloved team. So, we're just plucking them from all over and hopefully putting the right group of guys together to get us what we need, going into the next season. But one of the things that's super interesting was the fact that Josh Harris actually had a interview with Chick Hernandez from Station 9 WUSA, I think it was, and talked about, some things that were going to be coming up for the off season, long-term projects, I guess is probably the best way to put it, right? Many of which, we talked about it numerous times here, and that was, plans for the new stadium. And in that interview with Chick Hernandez at WUSA 9, Josh Harris, majority owner, basically kind of the face of the ownership of the franchise, talked about the next steps for the franchise, kind of where the franchise is going next, and some of the priorities for that, including plans for the new stadium. And Harris said, look, we're studying where we want to be and where we want our new home to be. We're going to continue to look at the sites in all the 3 jurisdictions. We've discussed them all here at Commander's Gridiron between Maryland, Virginia, and the district, and kind of more specifically some of those specific sites in each of those 3 jurisdictions. In the coming months, they're going to have some more to say about that, but it's a very complicated process in the sense that each site has its own little nuance in terms of the politics, the site itself. Is it good for football? Is it, what do you want to do with the area? How do you want to develop the area? How do you want to do it? So all that stuff's ongoing, and the committee, basically led by Mitchell Rails, minority owner and managing partner of the new ownership group, along with Josh Harris, Mark Ein, a little bit of Magic Johnson, and some other people are kind of leading that charge, but it's kind of being led by Mitchell Rails. So Hernandez asked Harris if the Commanders fans could expect a similar deal to the one that compared to the Philly got with the 76ers and their arena, which Harris co-owns with Blitzer and the Harris Blitzer Entertainment Sports Group, right? So, he basically said, hey, look, that stadium deal and package, which is probably the proper terminology for this discussion, for Philly, pledged the no cost to the city taxpayers. And Josh Harris kind of replied that, look, we're looking at all of that, and we're trying to shoulder as much of the burden as we can for cost. Obviously, arenas and stadiums are different price tags. All of us at Commanders, basically referencing all of the Commanders owners, all of us are fortunate, and we want to shoulder as much of the burden as we can. So that kind of leads us to believe that Josh Harris and company, look, all these guys are multi-billionaires. When you look at like the top 5 managing partners, including Josh Harris, that they could probably finance and build a new stadium project wherever, probably to the tune of about 90%, if not 100, to be honest with you, out of ownership pockets or private investment, right, with no public tax dollars. So it'll be interesting to see how this angle goes. He further went ahead and said, look, there's 3 proposed sites. Obviously, there's one in Maryland, predominantly one in Maryland, one in DC, and one in Virginia. Virginia has a couple options, though. Harris's team would not disclose the specific locations in each of those three jurisdictions, but said the fan favorite is still at the old RFK Stadium site in DC. So at least he has acknowledged that. Something that Dan Snyder never really would in the previous regime. Something, that fans wanted, whether it was team name, whether it was keep the mascot, the logo, color, whatever. He never really came out and said something. But the site for the DC jurisdiction stadium site is one that they are considering, which is the old RFK. So, as I just previously mentioned, that's what he and his company, the Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment Group, are trying to do in Philadelphia with an arena project dubbed the 76 Place. So, WSA 9 visited the city, walked the site of the Sixers' proposed downtown arena, met past many of those boarded up businesses with the Harris Blitzer Group Chief Diversity and Impact Officer and another individual. And it takes a lot of intentionality, right? So like you have to basically plan specifically how you want to do things, the process at which you want to do it, how you foresee it all happening, and kind of going from there, right? But that's something that we're doing here, and absolutely something that would be looking to do in DC, kind of along the same lines, right? And wherever we are doing business. So basically, they estimate that 70 to 80% of the storefronts in Philadelphia's Market East are vacant right now. So the stadium, I guess for them, the arena project will kind of help alleviate, not I won't say all of it, but a good majority of that. So that's something that they're kind of eyeing to bring to whatever stadium site / jurisdiction the Commanders decide to build their stadium at, which is kind of, let's be honest, is kind of what you see with every latest and greatest stadium, right? Is the stadium, I don't want to say urban renewal, but kind of that redevelopment, revitalization projects, right? And Dave asks, is RFK still holding sporting events? Actually, they're not. The last batch of sporting events was actually a year or two ago when DC United was actually holding soccer matches there before they got their stadium at Audi Stadium, I guess it's called, or Audi. I was going to say Audi Arena, but I guess it's actually called Audi Stadium. Down at the Navy Yard, like next to or like right down the street from Nats Park. And actually, ever since then, nothing's really been going on at RFK. So I know they actually fenced up RFK and, took, I don't want to say demolished it, but, took a bunch of the seats out of it because they're actually selling the old stadium seats and stuff like that, of which, kind of, I would love to have a pair down here in the man cave to kind of go with everything around me, as you see, but that's kind of a different discussion, different day, right? So, it's going to be super interesting what happens here with this project and what goes on. And, here we're going to monitor it. As we know, there's always something happening, whether it's legislation in a certain jurisdiction, the stuff that got passed in DC to kind of help get that site up on the front burner, something that's going to be super important to watch. Not necessarily because it deals with the Washington Capitals and, the professional ice hockey team in DC, but something to watch for more of the process and the politics that play into it. And what I mean by that was, for those of you that don't know and, are not hockey fans, Washington Capitals, Washington Wizards owner Ted Leonsis, who's actually the CEO of Monumental Sports, who technically, I guess, owns the Capitals and the Wizards, along with, the Washington Mystics and, some other professional teams in DC. Actually came out about a month ago, big pomp and circumstance press conference, Virginia governor, and says, hey, he's moving the teams out of the stadium in downtown DC to Alexandria, Virginia, basically across the river to a site that's going to be developed, yada, yada, yada. And, basically kind of doing it that way. Well, lo and behold, there was some legislation that needed to be passed by the Virginia General Assembly. And it came out yesterday that it's probably not going to pass for whatever reason. And reading the articles and kind of commentary that goes with it, it seems like it is straight up basically partisan politics. Not that, I want to get involved in that discussion and, kind of what side is looking for what and, in return for this and that and priorities and blah, 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 blah. But it looks like basically the General Assembly and the House down there in Virginia are going to hold this bill hostage against the governor, who's not of the same political party, and it's going to affect, possibly the development and further processing, so to speak, of this new arena deal going in for the Capitals. So the biggest question that kind of is lurking out there is that going to be some of the same hurdles, roadblocks, and hiccups that the Washington Commanders are going to face? And I would like to think that the answer is no, mainly because everybody knows that the stadium deal or the stadium lease for FedEx is up in 3 years, right? That's number one. Number two, everybody knows that FedEx Field is probably the most, or I should say, the least desirable stadium in the NFL. Shittiest stadium, no pun intended, after what happened 2 seasons ago. And, needs a bunch of money to stay afloat, needs a bunch of work, infrastructure, the whole 9 yards. So basically needs replaced. Whereas Ted Leonsis with the Washington Wizards and the Capitals has a older but really good arena, a Capital One arena in downtown DC in the heart of Chinatown, literally right on top of the DC Metro station. So, and then with the politics of basically just being like, we're just going to pick them up and move them. That's not kind of the same circumstances that we see with our beloved Commanders. So kind of knowing all that, I don't think we're going to hit those same obstacles. There's definitely going to be some obstacles in trying to get, some possible tax breaks, zoning changes, blah, 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 maybe a little bit of public funding if they don't end up shouldering the whole cost, either by strictly ownership group or combination of ownership / private investment. But, I don't necessarily see all of the politics keeping them from building a stadium in a certain jurisdiction when each of the jurisdiction is vying for the stadium to come there specifically. So definitely something that we're going to keep our eye on here over the next coming weeks and months. And, every couple episodes, we get some new stadium talk, as you see scrolling down there across the bottom. And, we'll report it and give some opinions and kind of see what's out there and kind of go from there. So as we switch gears from off the field news, going right into on the field news, let's be honest, it kind of is on the field news. We know that with the new coaching staff coming into town over the last 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about some of the specifics about it between the new head coach, offensive coordinator elect, so to speak, kind of like in the presidential terms, as well as the now outgoing offensive coordinator. Eric Biemenemy is no longer being retained by the new coaching staff as offensive coordinator, nor another offensive coaching staff position, whether it was quarterbacks coach, whether it was like passing game, whether it was like, whatever other topic consultant, whatever you want to throw it in there. No longer with the team. So basically came here, left the Kansas City Chiefs as a 2-time Super Bowl champ with them. Came here on a 1-year deal, actually, I guess 2-year deal. He still had 1 year left on his contract. Basically, it was 1 year done here with Commanders, and, now he's gone. But Eric Biemenemy lasted 1 season with the Commanders, and you kind of got to wonder what went wrong. So, for those of you that wonder what went wrong, let's talk about what went wrong with Eric Biemenemy here in DC. And look, the first thing I'm going to say is the guy is a tremendous offensive coordinator, has somewhat of a different old school, accountable, rougher, so to speak, coaching style and approach to his game and philosophy and techniques. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's obviously been effective and successful in his time in Kansas City. Unfortunately, with some of the things we're going to talk about here in the next couple minutes, it just didn't translate well to the Washington Commanders. Let's just leave it at that and let's jump right into it, right? So a lot of this information comes from a Washington Post article written by Sam Fortier and Nikki Jahava. Great Commander insiders. that I follow on Facebook and X. And, a lot of the tidbits on, what coach is getting hired, who's leaving, who's going, who's injured, blah, 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 come from some of these people. So, they're definitely some credible sources. And, this article that we're going to reference here a couple times puts out and kind of lays that timeline through the season as we talk about why and what went wrong with Eric Biemenemy here in DC. Right. And we know that, one of the first big decisions by the new head coach, Dan Quinn, was coordinators. And we're going to talk about the specific coordinators in the second half of tonight's show. But we know that basically Dan Quinn fired offensive coordinator Eric Biemenemy this past Monday. Actually, I guess a week ago from Monday, since yesterday was Monday. And even though he had 1 year remaining on his current contract with the Washington Commanders. So this move kind of seemed really likely, especially when Dan Quinn hired Cliff Kingsbury as the new offensive coordinator. So there was some speculation here in the DC area and amongst Commanders fans that they might just find a new role for Eric Biemenemy somewhere on the team in the coaching. Like I said, whether it was passing game coordinator, whether it was quarterbacks coach, whether it was, offensive assistant, whatever, that they might still retain him somehow, some way. But, as we come to find out, it just wasn't in the cards. Dan Quinn basically had a face-to-face conversation with Eric Biemenemy, and it's what we're going to talk about here in a couple minutes and go over the comments that were actually made by Dan Quinn about that conversation with EB and kind of go from there. So we know that the Commander's job actually had its plenty shares of difficulties when EB came in basically this time last year, a little later than this time last year. So, as I referenced earlier, look, he was coming in with an unproven starting quarterback in Sam Howell, or basically projected to be starting quarterback Sam Howell, with the signed backup, or what was going to be the signed backup here in NFL free agency a year ago in Jacoby Brissett. But he gave Biemenemy the play calling duties and added the title of assistant head coach when he came here to DC. But he inherited a roster that was built for the offense of the previous coordinator, Scott Turner, who was here for 4 years prior to that. And, didn't really have much time, cap space, payroll, decision-making, whatever, to tweak the offensive roster kind of the way he wanted it to fit what he was going to do as offensive coordinator here in DC. That makes sense. Follow with me, right? So, as we said, that included the minimal investment in the offensive line, which we kind of know as we went through the season, gave up, I think second, we were on pace to be the lead the NFL league in sacks for the majority of the season. And I think we ended up finishing second or third in most sacks. So at least we weren't the worst. But even so, it appeared to be another step towards trying to prove he deserved to run a team even after he spent 5 years in Kansas City, winning 2 Super Bowls with them as their offensive coordinator. Now, it is kind of interesting to note that he did interview for the Washington head coach vacancy position before Dan Quinn was selected. And we're going to kind of talk about that in the realm of scheme of things as we go through the timeline of what happened to Eric Biemenemy here in DC. But, as we look at Bienemy's lone season in Washington, the Commanders' offense was inconsistent and unbalanced, and quarterback Sam Howell regressed as the season went on. Biemenemy was hardly the team's only or biggest problem, as we kind of just alluded to. Look, you had a shitty offensive line. You gave up a really high amount of sacks. The ending record was 4-13, very subpar in a hard division in the NFC East, which was the result of a myriad of issues, which we could just list that laundry list here on the field as well as in the front office, right? But before Biemenemy arrived in Washington, his high-profile pursuit of a head coaching job had already raised a lot of questions as to why so many teams passed him over. And his quick exit from the Commanders actually raised more questions than it did give answers. So, you kind of got to wonder, okay, why wasn't EB selected for the head coaching spot here instead of Dan Quinn? Why wasn't he kept as offensive coordinator, even though he only had 1 year and he still had 1 more year on his contract? Why wasn't he given another title if they weren't going to keep him, as offensive coordinator? So, lots of questions, but not a whole lot of answers to go with it. So what went wrong? Ultimately, Quinn, like many coaches, wanted to bring his own guy in, which we saw 2 weeks ago. And he wanted to bring Kingsbury with him when he got another shot as head coach. And let's be honest, Washington's on-field results last season, I feel, had a direct impact and factored into the decision between A, him not getting the head coaching spot here in DC, and B, not remaining on the staff for Dan Quinn going into 2024. I think what we saw on the field and even off the field, for that matter, played a vital role going into those two things that we just mentioned, happening or not happening, so to speak, for Eric Biemenemy, right? So let's be honest. Let's look at the on-field results for last season that factored into that decision. The team tied for 23rd in offensive scoring, 24th in third down efficiency, and finished 30th in rush rate. Basically, 38.2% of the time we ran the ball or called running plays when the clock or the scoreboard didn't dictate run or pass per se. So, in the locker room, signs of frustration were evident throughout the season, as we kind of documented here at Commander's Gridiron, from training camp all the way through to the end of the season. After Washington's last game in Week 18, a blowout loss to the Dallas Cowboys, tight end Logan Thomas was as direct as any player has been about the simmering tensions between Biemenemy and his players, which is kind of interesting because we heard, anonymous reports throughout the time from players complaining, whether it was to the media, whether it was to Coach Rivera, whether it was stuff that happened in practice, in the exchange between McLaurin and Biemenemy that we're going to talk about here in a couple seconds, blah, 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 blah. So it's kind of interesting that this comes out from Commanders veteran Logan Thomas, kind of about what happened with EB, right? And he says, quote, "I might be the only one to say it, but I think we had our ups and downs with Biemenemy. We had some good, we had some bad. It was one of those things where something new comes in after you've been used to something else for a couple of years. And sometimes you can bang heads. But I respect him for coming to work every day and being the same person every day. So basically, hey, look, we bumped heads. We had some ups and downs. It was a roller coaster of a season. But I still respect the guy for being true to him and coming in and doing the same thing and being consistent every day, day in, day out." So other players who spoke on a condition of anonymity to discuss internal team dynamics in this Washington Post report described Biemenemy as a hardworking coach who hamstrung his own efforts with poor communication, stubborn play calling, and a disregard for player feedback. So when I kind of read that, it kind of jumped out at me, right? Because, we know EB was a demanding coach. We know he was a demanding offensive coordinator, always kind of preached the mantra of accountability, consistency, overtraining, conditioning, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, on the flip side, no matter how your coaching style and philosophy is, your approach of how you convey that to the players and the team, you still got to be good at two things: communication and kind of that adaptability and feedback between coaches, other coaches, coaching staff, of your team and your players, right? And apparently a lot of players felt that those two big things weren't happening as the season went on. Look, let's be honest. Biemenemy and Rivera, basically didn't respond to any comment for the story that was posted in the Washington Post. But as we know, one of the first public conflicts Biemenemy had with a player was actually in early August in training camp, which we went over here at Commander's Gridiron. We know that Ben St. Juice had a hard hit on Cole Turner, and he basically plays second string tight end. Stood over him, gave him some, verbal blah, blah, blah. And captain, wide receiver Terry McLaurin didn't take too kind to those actions, especially being in training camp, and basically what he thought was the dirty play from St. Juice to his tight end. And, basically got into his face, St. Juice's face, kind of addressed the issue, as a team captain to a player. Hey, look, this isn't what we do. It's only training camp, blah, 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 blah. That's not us. And as we kind of know the story goes, Biemenemy screamed at McLaurin and others to stop with the dumb shit and just do your effing job. McLaurin yelled back, "Can't do that shit to your teammate, bro." And while I thought that was actually directed to St. Juice, at the time back in training camp. Come to find out that that was actually directed to Biemenemy, who basically yelled the expletive statement to McLaurin during training camp, right? So then the next week, that's when everything kind of came out with Ron Rivera about whether Rivera stuck his foot in his mouth, about what happened with EB, blah 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 blah, and talking about EB's hard nosed approach. But we know as the season progressed, friction just kept remaining in that team, in that locker room for whatever reason. Multiple people said there was often confusion on game days because offensive adjustments were not clearly communicated to players and assistants didn't seem to be on the same page. Behind the scenes, some players urged their position coaches to beg Biemenemy to run the ball more, which is something that we kind of, as fans and even podcasters and game analyzers and everybody, from the professional guys on the sports networks to me sitting here in my basement, kind of preach. Let's run a more balanced offensive attack. We're passing. We see Sam getting sacked all the time. Luckily, he didn't get hurt, but Sam's leading the league in yards passing. Sam's leading the league in attempts. Sam's leading the league in interceptions. Let's run the ball. What happens when we were running the ball? When Washington's offense did run the ball, it averaged the 7th most yards per carry in the NFL at 4.43 yards per carry this past season. 7th most. That means that there were 25 teams that ran the ball worse than us when we actually ran the ball. So you would think that we would actually probably run the ball a little bit more. Why would you run the ball a little bit more? Because it actually gives, more balance to your offense, helps your offense create better plays, whether it's running and or passing, opens up the passing game, doesn't become as predictable when other teams line up and know that basically you're going to pass the ball, 6 out of 7 times, or for a very high percentage, right? Players thought that they didn't give Howe a fair chance, basically by doing that and not being more balanced of an offense. And I thought, a lot of players thought that we became a one-dimensional team, and it basically showed weekend, Sunday. We're passing 3, basically on a ratio of 3 to 4, right? 3 out of every 4 plays, we're passing. And apparently Rivera even addressed this issue with Biemenemy about, running a more balanced offensive attack and running the ball more. We didn't play complimentary football all year long, and it came back to bite us in the ass. Some players felt the Bienemy's intense practices, though helpful in training camp, left them exhausted before games, believe the practices created a greater risk of injury, and kind of went from there. Basically, because of the title that was given to him, allowing him to script practices and alter players' schedules during the week. And it all came basically by delegation through Ron Rivera. That let's be honest, a lot of players thought that throughout the season, this was basically EB's team, so to speak, and not necessarily Ron Rivera's. So, that's definitely interesting there as well. So, look, we opened up the season with 2 wins. Many players said they welcomed his changes, especially early on. The idea that people were rejecting any sort of change at all was just stupid, right? We were doing good. We were 2-0. Yeah, we beat the Cardinals, but then we turn around and beat the Denver Broncos, who, with promising first-year coach Sean Payton and quarterback Russell Wilson, we basically weren't supposed to win that game, but we did. And we started off 2-0. But Washington lost its next 3 games, a stretch that culminated in a 40-20 loss to the previously winless goose egg Chicago Bears at FedEx Field on Thursday night. Facing a massive deficit early because they kept hitting DJ Moore for like 50-yard touchdown passes. Biemenemy called 53 consecutive passes in that game. I knew it was a lot, but I had no idea that it was 53. When you're calling 53 passes in a row, like I feel comfortable that any one of our other show hosts here at Out of the Box Sports Network could literally call a defense to go against that, right? Like, why do you need to stack the box thinking that they're going to run the ball? They're not when they're passing 53 times in a row. Howe was hit 11 times, took 5 sacks in that games. And a lot of players saw that as a turning point in the season, which I think was like in week 5 of the season, maybe week 6. 2 weeks later, the New York Giants used blitzes and man-to-man coverage to beat up Howe, who took 6 more sacks and 12 hits in that game. And McLaurin, who rarely critiques coaching decisions or play calls, said he thought the Commanders could have countered better. When teams are blitzing like that, it leaves one-on-one opportunities. I felt we had those matchups. We just didn't take any advantage of that to give us chances to make plays down the field. Basically, and we kind of know, as Terry McLaurin said, post game against Miami Dolphins late in the season in December, who basically he didn't have any catches that game, which only happened for the second time in his career here in DC. Somebody said, "How do you feel about that?" And he goes, "Well, at least I ran a lot of cardio." And it's interesting that we get to the end of the season, and a lot of people were still touting how great of a coach EB is and why he should be a head coach and why he didn't get any head coaching vacancies before, blah, 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 blah. So after the season was over, we were out of the playoffs, obviously pretty early on. It became clear that Bienemy's time with the Commanders was ending, and the team gave him permission to speak with the Chiefs players ahead of the AFC Championship game. So you probably saw that on social media when he went to the practice, went to the locker room, talked to the Chiefs players and staff about the upcoming AFC Championship game. Patrick Mahomes has had some good comments about it, and the energy that he brought. And, look, it kind of just fizzled out over the course of the season and why he didn't come back, right? So, but like I said, last Monday, a week from yesterday, before Quinn's introductory news conference at team headquarters, the Commanders' new head coach actually met with Biemenemy one-on-one to finalize the inevitable. Look, we're not going to work together here, but in this coaching brotherhood, I wanted him to know man to man, I really respect the work that he's done here in the NFL. I was really pumped that he took his shot this year and went for it, even though he may not have had the greatest success that he wanted to. And that came from new head coach Dan Quinn. So, at least Dan Quinn recognized, what EB brought to the table, what he wanted to do, whatever he kind of assistant coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator strives to do when they come into, a new coaching position, title, whatever. And, it kind of just shows the level of respect that EB still has around the league, even amongst, other coordinators, offensive or defensive or head coaches for that matter. As Dave chimes in, Eric is a very good coach, but a horrible interviewer for head coaching jobs from what I keep hearing. And it's interesting that you bring that up, Dave, because, look, we had 8 head coaching vacancies in the NFL this year. And as I talked to a lot of people, coworkers, friends, fellow fans, and even my dad, when talking about some of this stuff, that, we know that every year that coaching change carousel is always somewhere between like 4 to 8 head coaching vacancies. So we had 8 this year. Half of those, 4, were filled by minority candidates. EB only interviewed for one of those 8 head coaching vacancies. And you can probably guess or already know which one that was, the one here in DC. So then the question begs, well, why didn't he get any head coaching interviews from any of the other teams? Whether it was just a matter of principle and to check the box to show everybody that you did the Rooney Rule because of EB, or the fact that you legitimately wanted to give him a shot for your position. Why wasn't he interviewed for Seattle? Why wasn't he interviewed for the Chargers, the Falcons, the Panthers, the Titans, New England? Even though New England kind of had it in his contract that they had to hire Jared Mayo. But he only had to interview for DC. So I think, like I said, the combination of what happened throughout the season on the field as well as off the field, and kind of knowing all those things together, sealed his deal for, not necessarily getting any head coaching looks this time around, but even more importantly, not getting the position as head coach here in DC. So before we talk about Mr. Dan Quinn, the new head coach of the Washington Commanders, we're going to hit up our sponsors here at Out of the Box Sports Network. The first one here tonight being, where is my sponsor? There we go. Monkey Coffee, the evolution of flavored infused coffee. Log on and use promo code OOTB Sports for your online discount at monkeycoffee.com. They got some great flavors. The newest flavor is honey agave, and they have the barrel aged honey to go with it. For those of you that like to add some fresh, sweet honey into your morning beverage, get all of your coffee supplies, t shirts, cups, mugs, everything else, infusers, and go online and grab those great flavors. Obviously, the newest flavor being honey agave to go with toasted coconut rum, bourbon chocolate chip, the Florida Sumatran blend, and well, so now we have this fourth one here. So use that promo code OOTB Sports for your discount at monkeycoffee.com. Jason Fine, aka Attorney Big Al. You can contact him at 1-800-HURT-123 for all of your motor vehicle accidents, slips and falls, workman comp, personal injury claims. Jason has 3 convenient office locations throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey, located in Philadelphia, PA, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, PA. That's Jason Fine, aka excuse me, Attorney Big Al. For all of your legal needs, give him a call. Tell me mentioned and saw us here at Out of the Box Sports Network. Remember, he doesn't win unless you win. Great guy, great representative. Gladly help you out with any legals that you need. Remember, that's Jason Fine, aka Attorney Big Al, at 1-800-HURT-123. All right, as we jump into the second half of tonight's show, we got about 3 to 4, probably 3-4 topics here, as you kind of see them scrolling across the bottom of the screen. And the first one that we talk about, and there's been, I don't want to say a lot of talk, but you could say slack, congratulations, disappointment, whatever you want to say, that, the head coaching spot search went to the now former defensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys, Dan Quinn. And, it's definitely a name that comes up in NFL, I don't say NFL history, but he does have history here in the NFL. Longtime coach, longtime coordinator, worked his way up through the system. But, as I just said, he was the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. In all honesty, some people were kind of either way. They were kind of like, good. We got Dan Quinn, good guy, solid coach, good person to change the culture, good person to lead our team and our roster, a good candidate to help rebuild and restock the defense to where it should be on our team. Then you have people on the other end that are like, basically he was the scraps of the 2024 coaching cycle and the interviews and everything that happened to us with that. And, so it's kind of interesting, right? So the Dan Quinn reaction, as we'd like to call it, on a scale of 1 to 10, Commanders fans basically had it at a 2. The football media had it at like a 6. A lot of people graded it, the head coaching styles. We were like actually last at like a D plus. And Dan Quinn, they gave, the new guy for the Tennessee Titans and even the Carolina Panthers like A's and B's and shit. And it's like, whoa, like we got Dan Quinn. Like, he's had stellar defenses in Dallas and Seattle, took his team in Atlanta to the Super Bowl, and you guys are only giving him a D. Like, what gives? So, like I said, Commanders fans gave him a 2. Football media gave him a 6, maybe a 5. Football coaches and NFL insiders gave it a 9 out of 10, right? So obviously they're seeing something that the casual fan doesn't. Whether the casual fan doesn't want to recognize the level of success that Dan Quinn has had as a defensive coordinator with his stint, and we're going to talk about here in a second, or the fact that he took, even though he didn't necessarily have the greatest record in Atlanta, look, he was able to coach that team in Atlanta and get them to a Super Bowl. He didn't win that Super Bowl, but he got them there. And, it's so difficult just to get your team in your respective conference out of 16 teams just to the Super Bowl. And he was able to do that. So, I look forward to seeing what he's going to do here. I think we're going to do some great things, and let's see what happens, right? So we kind of look at, hey, who is Dan Quinn? Where did Dan Quinn come from? Talk to me about this guy, right? So Dan Quinn started his coaching career at William and Mary in 1994. Did that for a year, went to VMI, became the defensive line coach at VMI. Then went to Hofstra, did the same thing for basically 4 years up until 2000. Then he jumped on to the San Francisco 49ers coaching staff between defensive quality coach as well as the defensive line coach between 2001 to 2004. Then he jumped to the defensive line coach to the Miami Dolphins for in 2005, 2006. So you can see where his level of or area of expertise is, defense. So we kind of like that, right? Went to the New York Jets for a season. Actually, went to the New York Jets for 2 seasons. Actually, 3. Yeah, 2 seasons. Defensive line coach. As I look at the timeline, then we go to Seattle. And, he had 2 stints in Seattle because he went to the University of Florida for a hot minute in between there. But while he was in Seattle, big contributing leader and coach to the Legion of Boom, and part of that whole great defense that, basically he helped put together and lead a top 5 defense in the NFL for the years that he was in Seattle. Went to the Falcons for 4 years as a head coach, took them to the Super Bowl one of those years, and then subsequently ended up in Dallas as their defensive coordinator, where, once again, turned Dallas into a top 5 NFL defense. So the guy has the resume to be able to coach people, to be able to, exude that leadership, to develop that culture that is so desperately needed in a team, or that a team needs to have going forward, right? So it's kind of interesting that people are kind of one way or the other, don't really want to have that open mind, don't necessarily want to see what happens. They're quick to judgment, whatever adjective or phrase you want to throw in there. Me, I welcome it. I say, hey, look, let's see what he can do. Let's see what staff he can put together and kind of go, see what happens. And over the, let's be honest, he didn't wait very long. Within 24 hours, he had some of his coaching staff, basically already put in place, announcing who's going to be filling what coaching position, and, what's going to be, who's going where, filling the spots, blah, 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 blah. So it's definitely interesting because we know that for the longest time, the team was focused, and I don't know if it was necessarily the team, but the media was focused on Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, coming to DC, being the head coach. If it wasn't him, it was going to be Mike McDonald, who was the defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens, ended up being the Seattle Seahawks head coach, right? So, a lot of people are like, why or how did we end up this way? What happened? I don't understand, like, how all this goes down. I read a really good article that basically had a timeline of, look, we knew they were going to fly to Detroit to do an interview with Ben Johnson, as we all know, as reported by the media, back and forth, some good things, bad things about each side. Ben Johnson told him while they were in the air, hey, I'm not going to interview. Once they landed in Detroit, they still had an interview lined up for Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator of the Lions. Glenn actually called them once they got landed in Detroit to interview him, and respectfully declined the interview, said, I'm no longer interested in the vacancy. So then basically Adam Peters has to turn around and, put a coaching search together. I don't want to say coaching search together, just kind of, I don't want to say regroup, but kind of look and refocus where they want to go, right? It was actually reported erroneously that Ben Johnson was the lock. Ben Johnson was, the serious target. And I kind of believe Adam Peters in his first stint as GM, right? That, that's not necessarily everything that happened and the way things went down, blah 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 blah. Um, so I don't feel like we got the scraps. I don't feel like we got the bottom of the barrel. Even though we were the last team to have our head coach named, I feel like we went through the process. We did it right. Something we haven't done in forever, especially under old ownership of the Dan Snyder era. So I feel like we got a really good candidate. I watched his introductory press conference from Commanders Park in Ashburn. The guy's fired up. He's ready to go to work. He addressed team management when he got in on his first day, team employees. The dude I think is going to be a solid guy for us. He's got a lot of decisions to help make over the next couple months between going to the combine, going to the draft, going free agency, blah, 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 blah. I'm kind of excited to see what kind of roster Adam Peters builds for Dan Quinn. But Dan Quinn had to build a coaching staff, right? And of course, what that comes with is two coordinators. The first of which we're going to talk about tonight is Dan Quinn actually hired Cliff Kingsbury as the new offensive coordinator, which actually resulted in obviously EB's dismissal, if you want to call it that, so to speak. And, we know that Cliff Kingsbury, had a high profile air raid offense, not only at the college level, but as a stint as Arizona Cardinals head coach. A lot of fans in DC media weren't too keen on Kingsbury just because of his coaching time at Arizona. But, let's be honest, he didn't really get much help from the GM there, didn't really get much help from the ownership, especially in building a roster other than having Kyler Murray. And even once he got things kind of settled down, understood, when was able to actually get the offense implemented, lo and behold, they had one of the top 10 offenses in the NFL there in Arizona. They just couldn't necessarily sustain it, right? So it'll be super interesting to see what happens with Cliff Kingsbury and kind of where they go on the offensive side of things, especially what happens at the quarterback position. So, look, there's obviously some connections with Kingsbury and possible draft. And, I'm excited to have him. I think a lot of people are excited to have Cliff here. And, let's see what happens, right? So one of the things, we talk about it and it kind of upsets or, makes some Cowboys fans emotional. Joe Witt Jr. followed Dan Quinn to DC and is now going to be the defensive coordinator. Witt was actually the Cowboys secondary coach and passing game coordinator. Kind of what excites me about this is that, because Witt was the secondary coach and the passing game coordinator in Dallas, barring injury, Dallas actually had one of the best secondaries in the NFL, in my opinion. And, for the most part, some of their stats back that up. Between pick sixes, interceptions, ball hawking, stuff like that. Unfortunately, they took on some injuries to some key players throughout the season. Didn't necessarily make some of, I don't say the best plays or some of the best cohesion at the end of the season, obviously, and giving up some points in their playoff game. But as a unit, they did really well. Joe Witt's our new defensive coordinator under Dan Quinn. So it'll be exciting to see what happens with that, right? Coming over from Dallas. Another guy, actually, let's talk about who we weren't able to interview. The Commanders were actually blocked by Jerry Jones to interview the DB coach Al Harris and tight ends coach Lundell Wells. I would have loved to have Al Harris here in DC, but, hey, unfortunately, Jerry Jones pulled, hey, you already took two of my guys. You're not taking two more. So, okay, whatever. We'll still fill some spots. The Commanders actually expected to hire former Eagles offensive coordinator Brian Johnson to a prominent offensive staff role. I was kind of curious what that was going to be. As Dave says, hey, he was shocked that the Kings didn't take the OC job for the Raiders. So yes and no, right? It was widely speculated that he was taking the job for the Raiders. Come to find out, and I don't know exactly what the exact conversation was between these two individuals. Somewhere along the line, Magic Johnson went to Cliff Kingsbury and said, "Hey, man, like, do you really want to go to the Las Vegas Raiders? You could come work as the offensive coordinator in Washington, D.C. for the Commanders. We have the number 2 draft pick. Basically, I can pay you a boatload of money, and, we'll make it happen." So lo and behold, within 24 hours, let's be honest, that's probably about how long it was. Probably didn't even get close to 48. Kingsbury says no to the Raiders, turns around, becomes the offensive coordinator in DC. So everybody's kind of like, hey, what happened, right? Then that's when a couple of days ago, the story got leaked out, was never denied or negated by anybody involved, that Magic Johnson basically, for all intents and purposes, single-handedly convinced Cliff Kingsbury not to take the offensive coordinator position in Las Vegas. So, hey, maybe Magic's actually good for something as our, part of our ownership group. Who knows? But it'll be interesting to see where Brian Johnson, former offensive coordinator for the Eagles, who worked with Jalen Hurts and, A.J. Brown and all those guys, and kind of that high prolific offense in Philly, where he fits into the system here in D.C. Now, there was some speculation that he was going to become the quarterback's coach, but we're going to talk about that here in a couple of minutes, that was already filled with somebody else. So whether he becomes like a passing game coordinator, whether it becomes just an offensive assistant, it kind of remains to be seen. But we got Brian Johnson from the Eagles here on our offensive staff as part of Dan Quinn's coaching staff for the Commanders. Flip side of the ball again. Let's go over to the defensive side. The Commanders hired Raiders defensive pass game coordinator Jason Simmons for the same role here in DC. So Simmons actually helped develop young corners Jair Alexander, Dante Jackson, and Jack Jones over the years, all guys who became well in their own right and rank of secondary players for each of their respective teams. The Raiders ranked 9th in scoring defense last year. So I think he's going to be also a good pickup for Dan Quinn's coaching staff here in DC. On to the next one. Tavita Pritchard, offensive side of the ball, will stay as the Commanders quarterbacks coach on Dan Quinn's staff. So this was actually kind of interesting because there was a lot of speculation about whether Pritchard would stay on as quarterbacks coach, being that everything that happened between Sam Howell, Jacoby Brissett, and EB, right? Were they going to completely clean house offensively? Were they going to leave some people in place, to kind of help Sam Howell develop under a new offensive coordinator and a new offensive scheme? Or were they going to bring in other people, Brian Johnson from Philadelphia? But ultimately, Dan Quinn decided to stay with Pritchard as quarterback's coach on his staff. So Pritchard was highly sought after, turned down some other, coaching opportunities in the NFL to stay in Washington. Was told by the DC media that he would really impress Quinn in his coaching staff interview, and new offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury as well. And both of those guys said, hey, look, let's keep Pritchard around to help with the quarterback development here in DC. So, let's go. Where do we go next? All right. The one side of the ball we haven't talked about yet, special teams. Washington Commanders hired Larry Izzo as their special teams coordinator. Larry Izzo was the special teams coordinator since 2018 in Seattle. 3-time Super Bowl champ as a player, grew up in the Northern Virginia area, actually Ashburn's Broad Run High School. So he has a good resume as special teams coordinator working under Pete Carroll up in Seattle. Actually had ties with Dan Quinn when Dan Quinn was in Seattle for a hot minute right before he went to Atlanta. So Larry Izzo comes over as the new special teams coordinator for the Commanders. On to the next one, right? What do we got? Washington hired Bobby Johnson as the offensive line coach. Reported by Tom Paracello and John Keim, Commanders insider. Johnson coached Buffalo offensive line from 2019 to 21 and was most recently with the New York Giants the last 2 years. Ultimately, he was fired this past season by Giants coach Brian Daboll. And he has coached tight ends at various stops throughout his coaching tenure in the NFL. So this is kind of a I don't say an eyebrow raiser, but good and bad, right? So we know the Giants didn't necessarily have the greatest offensive line this past season, as Dan can attest to, and some of the other members of the Big Blue Power Hour here at Out of the Box Sports Network. But we also know that the New York Giants didn't necessarily have all their offensive line pieces for the majority of the season due to injury, contract issues, free agency, whatever. Um, their star quarterback getting hurt and out for the season, and Danny Dimes, going through, some quarterbacks carousel, ultimately, landing on DeVito for the majority of the season. So, it'll be super interesting to see how Johnson works out as the offensive line coach here in DC. We obviously know we're going to be spending some draft picks. Don't know which one specifically, but some draft picks on offensive linemen. We know that we're going to be targeting some offensive linemen in the draft or in the free agency as well. So, it's going to be this gentleman's job to get that new unit to become cohesive, become one unit, become one good unit for whoever our starting quarterback's going to be, whether that's Sam Howell or it's somebody we're going to draft. So I kind of think, hey, a fresh start for this guy can work out fairly well and, can kind of revamp or rejuvenate the group that we need the most help with. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, right? Next up on the coaching side of things, it was kind of announced actually yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. That former Raiders and Seahawks defensive coordinator and dominant linebacker himself during his playing days, Ken Norton Jr., is joining the Commanders staff as their linebackers coach. Norton, who is a former All-Pro linebacker, most recently coached the position at UCLA under Chip Kelly. Now he reunites with former Seattle colleague Dan Quinn. When those two guys were together with that top 3 NFL defense in Seattle. So knowing that, hey, look, aside from our secondary being like Swiss cheese most of the season, we know that our linebacking core was absolutely horrendous. So we know that more than likely Cody Barton and, maybe another linebacker will probably be gone. So it'll be interesting to see what Ken Norton can do with that unit to kind of bring some prominence back to our defensive side of the ball and our linebackers and kind of see what we can do with those. Speaking of linebackers, the Commanders actually decided to retain Washington Redskin Commanders great all-time sack leader Ryan Kerrigan as linebackers coach, and basically assistant linebackers coach and pass rush specialist. Ryan actually held that position for the last 2 seasons for the Commanders, so it'll be interesting to see how Kerrigan and Norton can work together to, basically get the best out of that unit for our defense going forward in 2024. Commanders hired former Buccaneers assistant coach David Rye as their tight ends coach, reuniting him with Cliff Kingsbury. Those individuals worked together on the coaching staff when Kingsbury was the head coach in Arizona for the Cardinals. We didn't necessarily have an overabundance amount of problems with tight end. Some of it was injury, some of it was inexperience and youth. So I think, now having those guys together are going to benefit, just another aspect of the offensive side of the ball. Speaking offensive side of the ball, tight end coach Todd Storm, offensive line coaches Travell Wharton and Juan Castillo are not expected to return since we got Bobby Johnson and a new tight ends coach, right? So, let's kind of a little more out with the old and with the new. Let's see what this coaching staff can do. Washington actually hired Chargers and Raiders defensive coordinator John Pagano as a senior defensive assistant. Pagano's resume kind of speaks for itself. A lot of that defensive scheme position coaches, whether he was with the Broncos, the Texans, the Raiders, the Chargers, the Colts, dating back, as early as 1998. He's always basically been that a defensive assistant coach, defensive quality control on some successful teams, helped produce quality players at each of those teams in different positions as well. Was an outside linebackers coach, defensive coordinator for the Raiders, assistant head coach and defensive coordinator for the Chargers for 4 years, et cetera, et cetera. So, the guy definitely brings a somewhat successful defensive resume with him to the Washington Commanders. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Yes, the Commanders are hiring Cowboys assistant Sharif Floyd as their assistant defensive line coach. That was actually announced earlier today. Sorry, Dave and Paul. We commandeered one of your coaches as well today, so I think that's number 3 if you're keeping track. As the former standout Vikings defensive tackle, he continues to work his way up the coaching side of things. Floyd was with Dan Quinn in Dallas, as I just previously mentioned. So it'll be interesting to see how he can work with our defensive line, right? We know we got 2 stud tackles, Allen and Payne. What are we going to do on the edge? We know we got to replace some guys, Montez Sweat, Chase Young, whether it's through the draft, whether it's in free agency, use a combination of some of the guys that we had kind of filling in after the trade deadline where we got rid of those guys, etc. The potential's there for him to have a big impact with that unit on the defensive front. Another coaching update, wide receiver coach Bobby Ingram is staying in that role. He was actually the wide receiver coach for the Commanders. Had other options, but decided to stick around with the approval, of Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury. Why does Bobby Ingram sound familiar? Not only was he a coach here for the Washington Commanders, but he was a basically accomplished Penn State wide receiver from 91 to 95. For those of you Penn State fans and local college football fans, know that. Hey, we are. Was drafted by the Bears in 1996, played 4 years for them, played another 7 years for the Seattle Seahawks, where basically it's kind of where he came to fame, if you so to speak, as a wide receiver when he played for Kansas City. Seattle. Played a year in Kansas City, played a year where he ended up his career in Cleveland in 2010. Then basically came on the coaching side of things, was with the San Francisco 49ers, went to Pittsburgh, where he was a wide receiver coach there early on in 2012, 2013. Went to the Baltimore Ravens for 4 years as a wide receivers coach, went to the tight ends coach for 2 years with them, went as offensive coordinators and quarterbacks coach for Wisconsin for a year before coming to the Washington Commanders for the last, what will be his second season here as wide receivers coach. He has a great group of wide receivers to work with, and Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, Pringle, basically some other guys. I don't see us retaining Curtis Samuel, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But, basically the long short of it is, hey, so far that is who the Commanders have as their coaching staff. There'll probably be a couple more additions here and there, so to speak, in minor, lesser roles as we move on through the season. But, for the most part, all the big positions and roles are filled, which, gives you a lot of optimism to see where we're going to go. Speaking of where we're going to go, I call it the way too early look at the draft. So much speculation in what we're going to do, where we're going to go. With Cliff Kingsbury coming, here as the offensive coordinator, there's a lot of connections with him and Caleb Williams. And, what we're going to do at quarterback. What are we going to do? We have 5 picks in the top 100 in this year's draft between the first and second and third rounds. So we have a lot of flexibility. We have a lot of cap space too, pushing almost 80, 85 million. Add in the extra 10 million, I think at 10 or 12 million it is for the cap going up next year, or actually for this season. And it puts us around 100 million. Dave brought up a really good question that, hey, what about Terry McLaurin? Terry McLaurin at the beginning of last season, I think it was last season, actually signed a 4-year deal, technically 3 guaranteed 4th-year player option for the Commanders. So he has 2 more years, I think it is, under contract for the Commanders. I guess technically 1, and then, basically 1 that could be extended or whatever. But usually, by the time they get to that, they rework a contract or kind of make the decision, hey, we're going to franchise tag you or let you walk. So technically, he's got, I guess, one more year technically under contract before something has to happen. But we got a great wide receiver core in McLaurin and Dotson. Curtis Samuel is up for free agency this year. I don't necessarily seeing them bringing him back. So I think, obviously with us sitting at number 2, there's a lot of fans that want us to trade down and get more draft capital for the number 2 spot. There is wide speculation for whatever reason amongst the media that we're going to trade up to number 1 to get Caleb Williams. I don't see that happening. I'll call it right now. The Commanders are not trading up to number 1, nor should they. Adam Peters has kind of made it known that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. There's a process to follow. He learned all that when he kind of starting in Denver when he was part of those Super Bowl winning teams, but more recently here with John Lynch out in San Francisco when Lynch was the GM and Peters was the assistant GM, right? So I don't see Peters willing to give up a lot of future capital to go up one spot to get a guy. There's enough quality quarterbacks that would be available at number 2 if Williams goes number 1. And, quite frankly, the Bears have to figure out what they're going to do at quarterback, whether they're going to keep Justin Fields, trade him to another quarterback needy team and draft Williams, or what they're going to do. So, we're sitting in a really good spot. We turn around and have, 2 picks in the second round, 2 high picks in the second round, 2 high picks in the third round. So it gives us a lot of flexibility. I chuckle at all the mock drafts that are getting put out. Hey, we're taking this person, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're trading, blah, blah, blah. Nobody has a clue what we're doing. I don't think we can go wrong with quarterback. As much as I'd like to see Sam Howell return and take the reins, I kind of go with the philosophy that if you have the opportunity to upgrade the quarterback position, especially at number 2 in the NFL draft, you have to jump on that opportunity and take it, right? So whether that option becomes Caleb Williams because he dropped, whether it becomes Jaden Daniels, current Heisman Trophy winner, or Drake May out of the University of North Carolina, remains to be seen. But I think the Washington Commanders are going to ultimately end up drafting a quarterback at number 2. It's just a matter of which quarterback that's going to be. So, like I said, that's the way too early look at the draft, but it kind of is what it is, right? So knowing that, hey, look, it's going to be another 3 weeks until the next episode of Commander's Gridiron. What's going to happen in those 3 weeks? By the time we get to the next episode of Commander's Gridiron, the NFL Combine will have already come and gone. So we'll definitely give us a lot to talk about here as, hey, look, we have the number 2 overall pick, who showed up to the Combine, who skipped the Combine, because we know, look, a lot of the guys don't put stock in the Combine, even though they probably should. And, a lot of guys skip it and do their own pro days at their college teams. I get that, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll look at the Combine, kind of look at and see who did well, who didn't do well, who the Commanders are kind of targeting going through the Combine, who did well for them in their team interviews, kind of et cetera, that thing, and kind of look at that. And then, we'll kind of play around with the top 5 draft picks to kind of see if that puts any more insight into who we might be drafting or where we're leaning, or, by then, if anything leaks out, from the team as far as what their draft plans may be. Because we know that, look, even though the Combine is the last week of February, that free agency starts in the middle of March. So we do the show in the end of February, and by the time we get into our March show, we're going to be right around, if not at the beginning of free agency, which starts, I want to say, around March 12th, 13th, somewhere around the middle of March, maybe even be the 15th. So, as we get to each show, there's going to be something to talk about that's current in the NFL. Next show is going to be the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. The next show after that is going to be NFL free agency. The next show after that, we're probably going to be about a week before the NFL draft. NFL draft is the last weekend of April in 2024. So, we're definitely going to have some news and tidbits and discussion points for our beloved Commanders here, Commanders Gridiron, in each show moving forward. And as a reminder, the shows will be every third week. New time slot, 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. We went a little over tonight just to kind of cover everything that's happened over the last 3 weeks with coaching changes and kind of the recap of what happened with EB, so to speak. But, right, who are the Redskins? They're dead and gone. But as a sports memorabilia collector, they're still alive and well to me, right? But I get it. Chuckle, chuckle, ha ha. So, follow Out of the Box Sports Entertainment. Follow my personal pages, social medias. We'll be posting, obviously, the previews of when the shows are going to be coming, reminders of when the shows are going to be coming. As always, thanks for tuning in tonight. Glad to have you. Glad to see you. Hit those follow, subscribe buttons for all the shows and platforms that Commanders Gridiron is on. As always, Out of the Box Sports Network has your show for whatever you may be looking for. There's a show for each of the NFC East teams, whether it's them 215 boys, the Big Blue Power Hour, or the Sully Squad, hosted by our Philly guys. We have wrestling, we have boxing, we have NFL pick'ems, college game days, football frenzies, you name it. As always, we're always looking for new shows, new topics, new teams. If anybody wants to host their show for whatever sports topic you want, let me know. I'll get you in connection with the guys that do that here at Out of the Box Sports Network. Thank you for checking in. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in 3 weeks for another episode of Commanders Gridiron. Have a good night.